Imagine being told that you have a 1 in 26 chance of dying in your job. 1 in 26. That would be unacceptable in any modern workplace. That would be front-page news. That would result in investigations, lawsuits, demands for change. During World War II, American merchant mariners faced exactly those odds. 1 in 26 died in the line of duty, a higher casualty rate than any other branch of the United States military. Yet most Americans have never heard of them. They received no parades, no medals, no GI Bill benefits, no recognition as veterans until 19884, 3 years after the war ended. This is their story, and the story of a single convoy that became one of the war's greatest disasters and one of its most shameful moments of military decision-making. The Merchant Marine. Civilians at war. Before we can understand convoy PQ-17, we need to understand what the Merchant Marine actually was, because it was unlike any other military service. The United States Merchant Marine wasn't military. The men who served were civilian volunteers. They signed contracts to sail on specific ships. They didn't wear military uniforms, or at least, not always. They weren't soldiers or sailors in the official sense. They were commercial mariners, doing a commercial job, except that job was delivering war supplies across seas, infested with enemy submarines, aircraft, and warships. When World War II began, President Franklin D. Roosevelt saw a strategic problem. America was going to need to supply its allies, Britain, the Soviet Union, China, with massive quantities of war materiel, food, oil, fuel, ammunition, tanks, aircraft, trucks, thousands upon thousands of tons of supplies that had to cross oceans controlled by German submarines and aircraft. The only way to do that was with ships, and the only way to get enough ships was to use the commercial merchant fleet. So in 1936, Roosevelt signed the Merchant Marine Act, which essentially nationalized civilian shipping for the war effort. Ships that had been carrying cargo for profit were now carrying military supplies to war zones. By 1941, Roosevelt had established the Maritime Service and commissioned the War Shipping Administration to coordinate all merchant marine operations. Shipyards began building new vessels at a frantic pace. The most famous were the Liberty ships, cheap, fast to build, and numerous. Thousands of them were constructed during the war. Other ships, like the Victory ships and tankers, were also built in massive numbers. The men who crewed these ships came from all walks of life: farmers from Iowa, fishermen from New England, port workers from New York, longshoremen from California, young men trying to do their part. Some were too old for military service. Some chose the Merchant Marine specifically because they wanted to help without carrying a gun. Some were simply desperate for work. Frank Scott was one of them. Born in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, on the 9th of May, 1925, Frank was just 18 years old when he walked into a Merchant Marine recruiting office in San Antonio, Texas, in 1943. He'd grown up during the Great Depression. He'd taught swimming and worked odd jobs. When he heard about the Merchant Marine, he enlisted. He went to training at St. Petersburg, Florida, where he was so good at teaching swimming that they asked him to stay on. He taught new recruits how to survive in the water, how to make a life jacket from a pair of trousers, how to jump from a burning ship, skills that would keep men alive. The threat: Germany's Atlantic War. While Frank and men like him were training, a catastrophe was unfolding in the Atlantic Ocean. When the war began, Germany had fewer than 60 operational U-boats, but by 1942, that number had grown dramatically. German submarines began operating in wolf packs, coordinated groups that would attack convoys from multiple directions. The casualties mounted. In 1942 alone, an average of 33 Allied ships were sunk every week. The actual losses were staggering, but the American public was kept largely in the dark. Newspapers would report vaguely, 2 medium-sized Allied ships sunk in the Atlantic. In reality, tens of millions of tons of war material and supplies were going to the bottom of the sea, along with the men who crewed the ships. Between 1939 and 1,945, 3,500 Allied merchant ships were sunk in the Battle of the Atlantic alone. That's 14.5 million gross tons of shipping destroyed. Nearly 72,000 Allied naval and merchant seamen died. Of those, approximately 8,651 were Americans, though some estimates put the number far higher. For context, the United States Navy suffered a casualty rate of 1 inch 114. The Merchant Marine suffered 1 inch 26. The most dangerous route was the Arctic. From August 1941 onward, Britain and America had been sending supplies to the Soviet Union through convoys, sailing around Norway to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel. The route was brutally short in the summer, only about 1,500 miles, but it faced constant German opposition from aircraft, submarines, and surface ships stationed in Norwegian bases. The conditions were among the worst faced by any Allied sailors. The water was frozen. Icebergs floated in the shipping lanes. Ice buildup on the ship's rigging and hull could make a vessel top-heavy and prone to capsizing. The Arctic sun never set in summer, which meant no darkness to hide in, no relief from the constant threat of German attack. In winter, temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Men who fell into the water had minutes before hypothermia would kill them. Between August 1941 and May 1945, 78 Arctic convoys made the journey. The vast majority succeeded. But one convoy, Convoy PQ-17, became one of the greatest disasters and controversies of the entire war. Convoy PQ-17. The setup. On the 27th of June, 1942, a convoy of 35 merchant ships sailed from Hvalfjörður, Iceland, bound for Archangel, Russia. The convoy was designated PQ-17. About one-third of the ships were American. The rest were British, Soviet, and other Allied vessels. The cargo was worth approximately $700 million in 1942 dollars. It included over 300 tanks, 210 aircraft, 3,350 trucks, ammunition, food, fuel, and countless other supplies desperately needed by Soviet forces fighting for their lives on the Eastern Front. The convoy was escorted by British and American naval vessels. The covering force included the American battleship USS Washington, British cruisers, American destroyers, and other escort vessels. It was, at the time, the first large combined Anglo-American naval operation under British command. For the Allies, this was supposed to be a demonstration of partnership and military coordination. Commanding the convoy was British Commodore John Dowding. The overall operation was under the authority of the British Admiralty in London, specifically the First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, one of Britain's most senior naval commanders. As the convoy steamed eastward, German reconnaissance planes spotted it. German naval forces in Norway were alerted. Convoys like this had become a priority target. If the Germans could stop the flow of supplies to Russia, perhaps Stalin would give up. Perhaps Germany could break out of its two-front war. The first attacks came on July 1. German torpedo bombers and U-boats began harassing the convoy. The merchant ships and their escorts fought back, shooting down planes and evading submarine attacks. By July 4, 2 merchant ships had been sunk, the SS Christopher Newport and the SS William Hooper, both American Liberty ships. Casualties were mounting, but the convoy was holding together. Then, on the morning of the 4th of July, 1942, Admiral Dudley Pound in London received a disturbing piece of intelligence. Swedish sources had reported that the German battleship Tirpitz, sister ship to the famous Bismarck, one of the most powerful warships afloat, had left its base in Norway and was heading to intercept convoy PQ-17. If the Tirpitz reached the convoy, it could destroy the entire thing. A battleship like that, equipped with 16-inch guns and armor plate, could sink merchant vessels with impunity. The lightly armed escort vessels wouldn't stand a chance against a ship of that power. But here's where the story gets complicated. Admiral Pound asked his intelligence officer, Commander Norman Denning, to confirm this information. Denning was confident that the Tirpitz was still in its base at Altenfjord in Norway. He had no radio intercepts indicating it had sailed. The Norwegian resistance had sent no messages suggesting movement. He had no actual evidence that the Tirpitz was at sea. What Pound had was a report. That's it. Unconfirmed intelligence from an external source. The fateful decision. Yet on the basis of that unconfirmed report, Admiral Pound made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. At 2,111 hours on the 4th of July 1942, the Admiralty sent a message to convoy PQ-17, most immediate. Cruiser force withdraw westward at high speed. The cruisers, which had been providing important firepower for the convoy, began withdrawing away from the merchant ships. 12 minutes later, at 2,123 hours, another message arrived. Immediate. Owing to the threat of surface warships, convoy is to disperse and proceed to Russian ports. And then, at 2,136 hours, one final order. Most immediate. Convoy is to scatter. With those three orders, the protective screen around convoy PQ-17 dissolved. The escort vessels withdrew westward at high speed to intercept the German battleships that Admiral Pound feared were coming. The merchant ships were ordered to scatter, to split up, and make their individual ways to Soviet ports. It seemed logical. If the convoy stayed together, the Tirpitz could attack them all at once. If they scattered, they would be harder to find and hit, right? In theory, yes. In practice, it was a catastrophe, the disaster. With the convoy scattered and without escort protection, the merchant ships became easy prey for German aircraft and U-boats. The merchant mariners found themselves alone in the Arctic, in perpetual daylight, no darkness to hide in, with minimal defensive armament, and no military cover. The Germans, surprised and delighted by what had happened, began attacking immediately. Over the next week, one ship after another was sunk. The SS Navarino went down, the SS Helios, the SS River Afton, the SS Onomu, the SS Alcoa Guard, the SS Alamosa. Ship after ship was struck by torpedoes, dive-bombed by Luftwaffe aircraft, or attacked by German surface ships. Some crews made it to lifeboats and drifted in the Arctic for days, hoping to be picked up. Some sank with all hands. Some crews were picked up by German U-boats, only to be left to die in the frigid water. The horror was almost incomprehensible. One ship might have 40 merchant mariners and 30 U.S. Navy armed guardsmen aboard over 70 men. When a torpedo struck, many of them were below deck. They had minutes, sometimes seconds, to get topside and into lifeboats before the ship went down. Survivor accounts describe scenes of pure chaos. Men struggling to launch lifeboats as their ship burned or sank. Men in lifeboats watching other ships burn or vanish beneath the waves. The constant sound of explosions, the smell of burning oil and fuel, the knowledge that German planes could return at any moment to strafe the lifeboats. Of the 35 merchant ships that left Iceland, only 11 reached Archangel. 24 merchant ships were lost. In those 24 ships, 153 merchant mariners were killed. Hundreds more were wounded, traumatized, or captured. The material losses were staggering. 200 aircraft, 430 tanks, 3,350 trucks, 99,000 tons of food, fuel, ammunition, and other war supplies intended for the Soviet Union went to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. And the Tirpitz? It had sailed from its base on July 5, one day after the order to scatter, but turned around and returned to port that same day. German bomber pilots and U-boat commanders, not the Tirpitz, had done the damage. The battleship never even came close to the convoy. The aftermath. Blame and recrimination. When the extent of the disaster became clear, shock rippled through the Allied leadership. Winston Churchill called convoy PQ-17 one of the most melancholy naval episodes in the whole of the war. Stalin, when informed of what had happened, was furious. He had been promised supplies. he had been assured that the Allies would help him fight Germany. Instead, a quarter of the convoy had been lost, and the supplies he desperately needed were now at the bottom of the Arctic Sea. The disaster drove a wedge between the Allies. Stalin's trust in Churchill and Roosevelt was damaged. Soviet historians would later argue that the halt in Arctic convoys following PQ-17 was evidence that the Western Allies didn't really want to help the Soviet Union. This suspicion, partly justified, partly paranoid, would poison relationships for years to come. In Britain and America, blame was assigned. Admiral Pound was criticized for making a decision based on faulty intelligence. The British naval officer who commanded the escort, Admiral John Tovey, was blamed for not fighting harder to keep the convoy together. The convoy commander, Commodore Dowding, faced questions about his decision-making. But the men who really bore the cost were the merchant mariners, who had died, and the crews who had survived and had to live with what they'd witnessed. The Arctic convoy route was halted after PQ-17. It wasn't until September 1942 that convoy PQ-18 was dispatched, and this time with much stronger escort protection and air cover. The lessons of PQ-17 had been learned, but at tremendous cost. Frank Scott's War, a mariner's experience. Frank Scott's first assignment at sea came in January 1944, long after the PQ-17 disaster. He joined the SS Washita, an oil tanker that sailed in a convoy of about 200 ships to Swansea, Wales. The convoy wasn't attacked. The Atlantic route had become somewhat safer by 1944, and Frank was discharged in February when his contract was fulfilled. But he signed another contract almost immediately. This time, he sailed on the SS Samuel McIntyre, a Liberty ship. His captain was an elderly Scottish commander, called back from retirement to serve. Frank and the captain formed a bond over the many months at sea. The McIntyre sailed to Cardiff, Wales, where it picked up supplies for the invasion of Normandy tanks, ammunition, and hundreds of 5-gallon gas cans lashed to the deck. After D-Day on the 6th of June 1944, the McIntyre began shuttle runs, delivering supplies to Omaha Beach under the cover of darkness when possible. For nearly 2 months, from July 15 to August 31, the McIntyre sat anchored off Omaha Beach, fully loaded, waiting for the Allies to capture the port of Cherbourg so the ship could unload. Frank stood watch, watching the war unfold in France across the English Channel. He could see the flashes of artillery at night. Sometimes, from the ship, he could see what was happening on shore. Finally, the ship sailed on to Antwerp, Belgium, where it became one of the first to arrive after the Allies captured that critical port. It took about 4 weeks to unload. While on watch, Frank sometimes saw flares from German artillery being fired into Antwerp, as the Germans, still nearby, tried to disrupt the Allied supply effort. In December 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge began Germany's last major offensive in Europe, Frank's ship sailed back to the United States. He was discharged on the 11th of January, 1945. But he wasn't done. In March, Frank signed on again, this time on the SS Emile N. Vidal, one of the concrete ships built during the war. These unusual vessels were constructed of concrete because steel was scarce. Frank sailed in the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, carrying sugar and other supplies. He made multiple trips on this ship, then signed on to the SS Beckley Seam in July 1945. By August 1945, the war was essentially over, though the Beckley Seam was still at sea in the Mediterranean when Japan surrendered. The Forgotten Heroes. Frank Scott's story was repeated thousands of times over. Merchant mariners signed contract after contract, sailing on ships through dangerous waters, delivering the supplies that kept the war effort going. Some were killed. Many were wounded. All of them lived with the knowledge that at any moment, a torpedo, a bomb, or a shell could end their lives. Yet when the war ended, the merchant marine was forgotten. No parade down Broadway, no ticker tape celebration, no GI Bill benefits like the military received, no official recognition as veterans. Why? Partly because they were civilians, partly because the merchant marine wasn't organized the way the military was. partly because the casualties were spread across thousands of ships, and the losses weren't concentrated in any single dramatic event except, ironically, events like PQ-17, which were disasters rather than triumphs. And partly, historians argue, because the merchant marine's contribution was so essential and so constant that it was taken for granted. The Navy got the glory. The Marines got the headlines. The Army got the recognition. The merchant marine delivered the supplies, day after day, convoy after convoy, and nobody noticed, because that's what they were supposed to do. Between 1941 and 1945, approximately 250,000 civilian merchant mariners served in the U.S. Merchant Marine. Estimates of those killed range from 5,662 to over 9,000. An estimated 12,000 were wounded. Over 600 became prisoners of war, many of whom died in captivity. A total of 1,554 merchant ships were sunk. That's nearly 1,600 ships, commercial vessels that had been carrying cargo, that had been sailing in peacetime, that were suddenly conscripted into war and sent into the most dangerous waters on Earth. The Battle of the Atlantic, which lasted from September 1939 to May 1945, cost 3,500 merchant ships across all Allied nations. It was the longest military campaign of World War II. It was also, in some ways, the most brutal. The legacy: too late for recognition. It wasn't until 1984, 3 years after World War II ended, that the U.S. government officially recognized World War II merchant seamen as veterans. They finally became eligible for some benefits, though by then, many had already passed away. Frank Scott lived to see that recognition. He went on to have a full life after the war, married his wife Helen, and eventually moved to San Antonio with his family. He kept the photograph he had taken aboard the SS Beckley Seam, a picture of the American flag flying from the ship in August 1945, somewhere in the Mediterranean Sea, as the war came to an end. When he was interviewed in 2010, at the age of 85, Frank spoke about his wartime experiences with the clarity of someone who had never forgotten, but also with the humility of someone who knew that his story was just one among thousands. He noted that the 1943 movie Action in the North Atlantic, starring Humphrey Bogart, came close to capturing what merchant mariners actually experienced. The film had scenes from convoy PQ-17, and Frank said, "It was close to my actual wartime experiences." Other merchant mariners went on to fame. James Garner, Peter Falk, Carroll O'Connor, and Jack Lord all served in the Merchant Marine during the war, before becoming famous actors. But even they rarely talked about that service, and it certainly wasn't what made them famous. The story of Convoy PQ-17 is a story of military failure and tragedy. Admiral Pound made a decision based on faulty intelligence that resulted in the deaths of over 150 men and the loss of critical war supplies. He was later criticized by naval historians, and the decision haunted him until his death in 1943. But the story of the U.S. Merchant Marine is larger than any single convoy or any single decision. It's the story of civilian volunteers who understood that their country needed them, who signed up to sail into danger, knowing that submarines and aircraft were lurking, knowing that the odds of survival weren't great, knowing that if they were killed or wounded, they might not even be recognized as veterans. These men didn't get medals. They didn't get parades. They didn't get the GI Bill when they came home, but they kept the lifeline to Britain and the Soviet Union open. They delivered the tanks and aircraft that allowed the Allies to fight. They brought supplies to American soldiers fighting in the Pacific and Europe. 1 in 26 died. That's a statistic. But behind that statistic are thousands of stories. Stories like Frank Scott's. Stories of young men from small towns and big cities, from farms and ports, who went to sea during wartime and came back changed if they came back at all. The U.S. Merchant Marine in World War II is, perhaps, the most overlooked contribution to the Allied victory. Not overlooked because it was unimportant, it was vital, but overlooked because it was so constant, so reliable, so unglamorous. Ships sailed, supplies were delivered, men died, and the war went on. That's the real legacy of the Merchant Marine. Not any single dramatic moment, but the quiet, constant work of keeping the war effort supplied across thousands of miles of dangerous ocean.